On December 20th, 2022, the Dragon Ball Super Manga will be making its return. And to everybody's shock, the manga will be focusing on Goten and Trunks, as this is going to be a prequel arc to the events of Dragon Ball Super Hero, and it also mentions that Gohan and Piccolo are expected to have a role in the manga, as reported by Dragon Ball Super Hype. Now, the topic of this conversation, as you can see from the title, is really asking whether or not you actually care. And this is to bring up a bigger point about Dragon Ball history and this event itself. Because after speaking to multiple people on Discord and getting a feel for what Dragon Ball fans are thinking, in combination with also observing how the Dragon Ball community has reacted in the past, this is one of those situations where it's hard to gauge what the Dragon Ball community actually wants. And the main reason why is because if you make videos about Dragon Ball, you only have a small sample size of what the millions of Dragon Ball fans worldwide actually think, and considering the fact that people who would be watching people discuss Dragon Ball on YouTube would most likely be hardcore fans that would watch anything, you can pat yourself on the back because there's a very good chance you watching this video falls into that category. But to be specific about this upcoming arc, it's once again one of those situations where a lot of people are bored with this idea. Let's begin with Goten and Trunks actually aging. You see, as you've seen on this channel and from what other creators have discussed, Dragon Ball fans have been pretty upset with the fact that Goten and Trunks have not aged throughout the story for many years. And there's a pretty good reason to understand exactly why this is. Because from an artistic point of view, if you look at future Trunks and compare him to the present Trunks, the future Trunks that witnessed future Gohan's dead body was around 13 plus years old. How do I know that? Well, if you go back to the History of Trunks special, and even if you look at the manga, it was said that 13 years passed after Goku had passed away of a heart virus. And when you look at the TV special and when you look at the manga and you just simply do the math, if Trunks was a newborn and 13 years past, that means he would be around 13 years old. So that means 3 years later, after Gohan had died, he would have been around 16. Now, if you compare this directly to what Trunks was before Gohan died, so he's kind of in like that pseudo-teenager or preteen state when he's around 12 or 13 years old, that Trunks appears to be older than the 7 or 8-year-old looking Trunks that we saw in Dragon Ball Super. So if Trunks appears that he's 8 in Dragon Ball Super, but we know for a fact that he's older than the preteen version of himself that we saw in the History of Trunks and even the manga, it would make obvious sense that they're clearly not aging Trunks on purpose, because mathematically he has to be older than that, just simply based off the fact of how much time had passed in Super before he and Goten supposedly had their growth spurts and apparently caught up in age. So with all of that said, Dragon Ball was basically sticking a finger in our face that they didn't care about aging Trunks, even though we can use his future counterpart to prove that he should look older than what he actually was. So with all of that said, they did this for several years, and we just kind of tolerated Goten and Trunks not being older until they eventually aged them in Dragon Ball Super Hero. So on one hand, we finally get a chance to see what Goten and Trunks would look like older, because prior to that movie, the only time we had actually seen that was at the end of Dragon Ball Z when we saw everybody during the tournament. So factoring all of that in, it makes logical sense for Dragon Ball fans to have intrigued interest about Trunks and Goten being older, because this is actually going to be an arc that focuses on them. But yet, it's once again a situation where Dragon Ball does something creative and different, and the fans aren't really excited by this. But this isn't the first time that this happened, because if you go all the way back to Dragon Ball Super, you guys would remember that we had what was called the Potafu arc, where Goten and Trunks once again got a little bit of shine in those episodes, which were basically filler episodes, and the whole thing about Copy Vegeta and all of that stuff. But it was bad, and it wasn't the most interesting story, but it was once again a situation where Goten and Trunks had their shine, and Dragon Ball fans weren't excited about it. And even if you go back to the Buu saga, from just a general sense of the Dragon Ball community, I could also speak for myself on this, that a lot of Dragon Ball fans feel like the weakest part of the Buu saga was when Gotenks was fighting against Super Buu. Now, obviously, you can say that's an opinion, but generally, from what I've observed, most Dragon Ball fans tend to have really liked the beginning part of the arc with Maj and Vegeta and the mystery of Babidi and Buu and all of that stuff, and then later on when people were fighting against Kid Buu and when Vegeta was fighting against Super Buu. Those are generally the most popular parts of that arc. And it seems like fans generally think that the Gotenks arc was the worst because it was hard to take the fight seriously and so many things were dragged out. So, as you can see, throughout Dragon Ball history, and you could even use the movies to look at Broly's Second Coming or Bio Broly, it seems that whenever Goten and Trunks get the spotlight, because this is not the first time that this has happened, the story seems to just perform the worst, and people seem to have the least amount of interest in it. The only thing that we can talk about that was successful with at least Kid Trunks in the present timeline would have been Wrath of the Dragon, which wasn't all about Trunks, but he had a pretty important role in it, and that was a fairly successful Dragon Ball movie. But outside of that, every time Goten and Trunks are around, people just don't care. So, it's one of those mixed bags where I can understand why people wouldn't be excited for it, but at the same time, I would feel excited for this considering that it's something completely new. Now, this brings about another question in dealing with Black Frieza, because obviously we expected to see what was going to happen to Black Frieza, and it seems like whatever's going to happen to Frieza is going to kind of take somewhat of a hiatus where Frieza exists in the universe, but the story's not necessarily focusing on him. Because it's kind of weird that we just ended this major arc, and then we go into a whole different arc with Goten and Trunks, which kind of feels like this is a filler arc in some sorts. And I could definitely understand why people wouldn't be as excited about this, because it's like you literally just gave us an arc about Frieza. Well, I should say, you gave us an arc that ended with Frieza, and then all of a sudden you want to move on to Goten and Trunks. I feel like the timing of this is not the best. And I think I could be objective in saying that I feel like this would have been a good arc to do, like, after you kind of do a little bit more with Frieza. Even if you want to put that arc on hiatus, the timing of this actual arc itself was just poorly timed, because it just feels too out there. You know what I mean? And ultimately, I think that when we look at this arc as a whole, I think that, as Dragon Ball fans, we've shown throughout history that we are not always fully sold on our ideas, because when we look at characters like Goku and Vegeta, they're the winning formula in Dragon Ball. They're the formula that always brings in the most money, because you can't really fail with them. They're the two most powerful characters. A lot of money's invested into them and their designs, new transformations, movies, all of that. So it makes logical sense that whenever Goku and Vegeta are the main stars of the movie, that winning formula works, and it's a safe formula to use, which is why, if you look throughout Dragon Ball history, yeah, you can say the pandemic had an impact on it, but it would show why the Broly movie was far more successful than Dragon Ball Super Hero. And it's the same thing with Gohan and Piccolo. As Gohan and Piccolo are my two favorite characters, I can honestly admit that I was very happy to see Dragon Ball Super Hero, and you know, from my perspective, I might have bias because they're my favorite characters, but I thought it was a refreshing, interesting idea to bring up the Android arc again, and also to bring back a different version of Cell, and also give Gohan and Piccolo shine. But of course, you also will have the segment of fans that just kind of want the more generic Dragon Ball content, and also the content that features a character like Broly, because Broly has been reused a bunch of times, but he's a formula that works, the same way that Frieza is a formula that works, as what we saw at the end of the Granola the Survivor arc, because you can't go wrong with Frieza, you can't go wrong with Broly, but when you start experimenting with other characters, that's when you can go wrong. And the safest characters to use is always use Goku and Vegeta as protagonists, but the problem with that is that you end up creating a show where Goku and Vegeta are so much stronger than the other characters that the other characters can only really fight henchmen-like characters, as we saw during the Mora arc, which was arguably the best arc in Dragon Ball Super to this day. But, at the same time, the only thing that the other characters can do, unless they get a power-up themselves, is just fight the weaker characters, because the only characters that can really fight against the main characters would be Goku and Vegeta. So ultimately, at the end of the day, guys, this is a really mixed bag, but I think that we should look on this Goten and Trunks manga segment and be excited for it. Obviously, I mean, we could probably expect that this is going to be very lighthearted and not serious. It probably seems like it's going to be something more so along the lines of the Great Saiyaman arc, or something along that lines, where it's kind of like you're fighting against like weaker characters or characters that aren't necessarily relevant, while Goku and Vegeta are away trading for Frieza or doing whatever during this whole time skip that we're probably gonna see. But ultimately, at the end of the day, guys, this has been our video. Please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys, and let me know if you care about this arc featuring Goten and Trunks, as that is the featured question.